I knew something was off the moment Blake strutted into the conference room like he'd just been promoted to God. His voice hit first, loud, confident, the kind of pitch men use when they're terrified someone might notice they have no idea what they're talking about. "We're modernizing everything," he announced, clapping his hands like a motivational speaker at a discount retreat. Behind him, the glass reflected a dozen faces, seasoned people who'd been through mergers, layoffs, and strategic realignments before. Most of them were too tired to roll their eyes. But Russell wasn't. He just leaned back, calm as a winter lake, watching Blake like you'd watch a kid trying to start a lawnmower with no gas. Russell had been with the company for decades, back when people still printed things, when files lived in cabinets, not the cloud. He wasn't loud, never needed to be. His authority came from precision, from the quiet power of a man who built systems that didn't break. Most people didn't even know his real title anymore. The org chart called him Senior Process Advisor, which was corporate code for the guy who keeps the lights on while the rest of us argue on Zoom. When the merger whispers began, he stayed invisible on purpose. He knew the moment executives start sniffing for redundancies, people with real knowledge become dangerous. Blake didn't see it that way. Fresh off his MBA, armed with a PowerPoint and a famous last name, he started calling himself Transition Director, the CEO's nephew. Nepotism in designer shoes. Every sentence he spoke had at least one buzzword: synergy, lean transformation, next-gen value delivery. You could practically hear the TED Talk applause track behind him. And while the rest of us nodded politely, Russell just observed. He caught details. The way Blake skipped the red-lined pages in the merger binder, the way he flinched when asked about license dependencies, the way he kept saying, "We'll fix that post-close," like legal documents were drafts you could edit later. Russell told me once over burnt coffee in the break room, he's not the problem. The system that rewards people like him is. I didn't know then how prophetic that would sound later, but there was something in his tone, half humor, half fatigue. He'd survived enough restructurings to know arrogance always has an expiration date. Before I go further, if you're still listening right now, take a second to subscribe and tap that like button. Seriously, 97% of people listen without subscribing, and it really helps the team keep bringing you these stories. Okay, back to the chaos. Blake started doing walkthroughs of departments he didn't understand. IT, finance, compliance, it didn't matter. He'd flash his access badge, nod at random people, and drop phrases like, "We'll optimize this vertical soon." You could almost see the managers holding their breath, praying he wouldn't ask what anything actually did. Russell would be standing nearby, hands in his pockets, quietly amused. He'd been through 3 CEOs, 4 acquisitions, and 1 near bankruptcy. Watching Blake wave his arms around about digital transformation was entertainment to him, a soap opera with spreadsheets. But beneath that dry humor, there was a flicker of unease. Russell had built much of the framework the merger depended on: systems contracts, license structures, the hidden plumbing that made everything talk to each other. And Blake? Well, Blake didn't even know those systems existed. When he talked about cleaning house, he meant clearing out the old names. People like Russell, people who'd built the very walls he was standing in. That first week, I saw Blake pull Russell aside in the hallway. He didn't lower his voice. "We'll be trimming the fat soon," he said. "Don't take it personally. We're moving fast." Russell gave the smallest smile, the kind that could be mistaken for agreement or a warning. He simply said, "Just make sure you know what you're cutting." I remember that line vividly because it sounded harmless then. But later, in that conference room full of lawyers and investors, it would echo back like thunder. The Slack notification came through just before lunch. One of those pings that feels wrong before you even open it. I saw Russell glance at his phone, squint, then set it down without a word. A few minutes later, Blake's voice echoed from his office. "Big moves today, people. Change is good." The kind of false enthusiasm only a man firing others could stomach. Word spread fast. Whole departments were being streamlined. Legacy systems shut down. Longtime managers escorted out like thieves. Blake was calling it a transition cleanse. Everyone else called it what it was, a bloodbath. When I finally saw the message, it was short, almost lazy. "Russell, you've got 2 weeks. We're going in a new direction. Appreciate your service." That was it. No meeting, no HR handoff, just a digital execution buried between pizza party reminders and Slack emojis. Blake even reacted to his own message with a thumbs up. The man actually congratulated himself on firing a cornerstone of the company. Russell didn't slam his keyboard or storm into anyone's office. He just opened his email, attached the message, and forwarded it to Legal M&A Compliance. His expression didn't change, but something in the air did. That subtle tension before a storm when the sky goes perfectly still. His silence wasn't resignation. It was calculation. By the end of the day, desks were empty. The printer room looked like a battlefield. Paper stacks, forgotten mugs, nameplates turned face down. HR handed out boxes like party favors. Blake strutted around, shaking hands with people he'd never met before, telling them, "Nothing personal, just synergy, folks." He looked proud, like he'd finally done something worth reporting to Uncle CEO at Sunday dinner. What he didn't realize was that every termination needed documentation, especially for senior advisory roles tied to compliance oversight. And Russell's name wasn't just another name on payroll. It was inked on more documents than anyone upstairs could imagine. I walked past his office later that evening. The lights were dim, his jacket still hanging on the chair. He wasn't packing. He wasn't even pretending to. He was writing. One page after another, notes in his neat block handwriting, occasionally glancing at his screen. No anger, no panic. Just that eerie calm you see in chess players who already know the match is over. They're just waiting for the other side to realize it. Blake, meanwhile, was celebrating in the break room. I overheard him bragging to one of the junior analysts, "We're trimming dead weight. This will look great on the acquisition metrics. The buyers want lean." The analyst nodded politely, pretending to understand. Russell? Sweet guy, but outdated. Guys still talking about paper trails. We're in the cloud now. Laughter followed. Blake loved an audience. Russell stepped out briefly, passing the break room door. He didn't even glance inside. He just walked toward the elevator, phone in hand, and said quietly, "Funny thing about clouds, they still cast shadows." Then he was gone. I didn't know it then, but forwarding that Slack message wasn't just self-defense. It was the first move in a larger game. One Blake didn't even know existed. While he was busy counting the people he'd fired, Russell had already filed something that couldn't be undone by corporate swagger or family privilege. He wasn't fighting for a job. He was setting the stage for something far bigger, a reckoning wrapped in paperwork. The conference room looked like a crime scene dressed for a wedding. Too much glass, too much light, too many people pretending not to sweat. The $245 million acquisition meeting was supposed to be a formality, a quick handshake before champagne. Rows of suits filled the room, lawyers, consultants, board members, a few shell-shocked department heads. Blake walked in late, of course, radiating that smug, performative confidence of someone who mistakes volume for authority. He was grinning, shaking hands, calling people by first names he'd just learned that morning. "We're in great shape," he declared to the buyer's CEO, as if he'd built the place himself. Russell sat 3 seats from the end of the table, quiet as always. A folder open in front of him, pen resting on the page. He wasn't supposed to even be there, at least according to Blake's Slack message. But the meeting invite came directly from the buyer's operations team, who had requested all key compliance liaisons be present. Russell had helped design those protocols years ago, and the irony of watching Blake overlook that requirement was almost poetic. Blake began his presentation with slides full of buzzwords and meaningless metrics. Streamlined workforce, optimized org flow, post-merger synergy. He strutted around like a man auditioning for his own TED Talk. Every sentence was another nail in his own coffin, but no one knew it yet. "We've cleared out the redundant roles," he said, clicking to a slide titled Legacy Workforce Rationalization. Then, in front of both legal teams and the acquiring company's leadership, he smirked toward Russell. For example, "Russell here, great guy, but we're modernizing. He's out. No offense, buddy." The room froze. Even the hum of the AC seemed to pause. Russell didn't flinch. He looked up slowly, adjusted his glasses, and said with the kind of calm that slices deeper than shouting, "I see." Then he closed his folder, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a single card. No speech, no emotion. He simply slid it across the table to the buyer's CEO. The CEO took it, glanced down, then his entire expression changed. A flicker of recognition, then disbelief, and finally, amusement. He leaned back, exhaled through his nose, and started laughing. Not the polite kind, real, stunned laughter that rolled through the room like a ripple of confusion. "Oh, this is rich," he said, eyes still on the card. He handed it to his general counsel, who read it, blinked, and muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "Oh, hell." Blake's grin faltered. "What's funny?" he asked, his tone suddenly tight. The buyer's CEO didn't answer. He just looked at Blake the way you'd look at someone who'd accidentally set fire to their own resume. "Did you, by any chance," he asked slowly, "run the licensing map before you started cleaning house?" Blake blinked, confused. Our internal audit handled that." Russell didn't say a word. He just leaned back in his chair, hands folded, watching the panic spread. He'd been underestimated so completely that the truth hit like an aftershock. On that card, in crisp black print, were the words, "Russell H. Danner, Principal, GBD Licensing Holdings." And in that instant, everyone in the room realized what Blake never had. Russell wasn't just another aging advisor. He was one of 3 silent partners who owned the very license the merger depended on. Without his consent, the acquisition couldn't close. Russell sat there, still and expressionless, while Blake's face drained of color. The buyer's CEO pushed the binder aside, folded his hands, and said evenly, "Let's pause here." And just like that, the room that had started the day certain of its victory turned into a theater of quiet dread, with Russell as its calm, unassuming star. The sound of that laughter didn't fade. It lingered, thick and humiliating. The buyer's CEO leaned back in his chair, holding Russell's card between 2 fingers like it was a grenade with the pin half pulled. "Well, this is awkward," he said lightly, but there was steel behind the humor. He turned the card over once, twice, then slid it toward his general counsel. "Someone want to explain why a man who just got fired is listed as a principal in the license holdings that govern our integration platform?" The counsel's brow furrowed as he pulled up his tablet, scrolling rapidly through documents. Across the table, Blake's smug posture began to shrink. He tried to laugh it off. "That must be a mistake. Some legacy paperwork," the lawyer interrupted without looking up. "That defines operational control for the joint data infrastructure." He paused, "and, according to this, requires ongoing consent from 3 principals, one of whom is sitting right here." He turned his eyes toward Russell. "Mr. Danner, would you mind confirming your role for the record?" Russell didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He simply said, "Principal signatory, active status." Then he leaned back again, as if that settled the matter, which of course it did. Blake's face went from red to pale in seconds. He glanced toward his uncle, the CEO, but the older man wouldn't meet his eyes. The buyer's CEO rested his elbows on the table. "Mr. Prescott," he said, tone smooth but sharp as glass, "did you or did you not review the license map before beginning personnel restructuring?" Blake stammered. "I delegated that to our compliance team. I assumed." "You assumed," the buyer's lead counsel cut in, "that you could terminate a principal signatory without consequence?" He snapped his tablet shut. Good God. The silence that followed was unbearable. You could feel Blake's confidence peeling away with every heartbeat. The young analyst in the corner started taking notes slower, as if afraid the sound of typing might set something off. Russell broke the tension, not with a speech, but with a single sentence. "I believe the agreement defines termination of principal as grounds for license reversion." His voice was calm, factual, almost kind, but that one line landed like a depth charge. Everyone in the room suddenly realized what that meant. By firing him, Blake hadn't just insulted a veteran employee. He'd triggered a clause that could nullify the entire acquisition. The buyer's CEO turned to his team. "Pause the integration agenda," he said. "We're not proceeding until this is clarified." Then, without looking at Blake again, he nodded to Russell. "Mr. Danner, may I speak with you privately after this?" Russell nodded once, closed his folder, and waited. No triumph, no anger, just quiet inevitability. Blake sat frozen, his hands twitching near his laptop as if he could somehow Kitar El-Zad the last 15 minutes of his life. But the damage was done. His swagger, his title, his inherited authority, all of it was unraveling in real time, shredded by a single business card and a truth he never bothered to learn. When the meeting adjourned, the buyer's CEO was still smiling faintly, the kind of smile that comes from watching arrogance collide with reality. Blake stayed seated, staring at the polished table as if it might swallow him whole. Russell stood, buttoned his jacket, and said quietly to no one in particular, "Titles are easy to give. Ownership, not so much." Then he walked out, leaving a room full of powerful people who suddenly realized they didn't understand who really held the keys. Within 20 minutes, the acquisition room went from corporate choreography to sheer panic. The buyer's counsel had 3 phones open, the seller's lawyers were whispering in corners, and the CEO's nephew, Blake, sat motionless, eyes darting from one executive to another as if he could still talk his way out. But this wasn't something he could patch with charm. The facts were brutal and simple. GBD Licensing Holdings, the quiet third-party entity Russell represented, didn't just supply a software license. It owned the operational framework that allowed both companies' platforms to legally share and process data. Without GBD's active consent letter, the merger was as worthless as a car without an engine. And thanks to Blake's impulsive Slack message, "Russell, you've got 2 weeks. We're going in a new direction," that consent was now invalid. The minute he declared Russell terminated, the digital authorization tied to Russell's key credential automatically lapsed. The system, cold and obedient, had followed protocol perfectly. It had stripped the company of its own license at the exact moment they needed it most. The acquiring CEO was no longer laughing. He stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, muttering to his general counsel in a tone that mixed disbelief and fury. "You're telling me they removed a principal signatory mid-deal? Without an amendment? Without a consent renewal? Jesus Christ, pull the offer." At the far end of the table, the seller's legal director was frantically flipping through a red binder. The color drained from her face as she found the clause. "Section 7B, she whispered, pointing to the page. "Active consent must be reaffirmed by all principals at or prior to closing. Any lapse constitutes automatic suspension of execution rights." Russell, still seated, watched it unfold with the serenity of someone who'd already played this game before. He wasn't smirking, wasn't smug, just quiet, observant. A man who'd spent decades understanding how systems were built, and how arrogance always underestimated the fine print. Blake finally broke the silence. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "We can just reissue the consent, right? It's a formality." The buyer's general counsel turned to him slowly. "No, Mr. Prescott, it's a legal attestation. You can't reissue what you voided. Mr. Danner's termination removed his voting capacity. The system recognized that action as withdrawal." Blake's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked toward his uncle, the CEO, for backup. But the older man was already on his phone, whispering in a voice that carried one emotion Blake had never seen from him before: fear. The buyer's CEO ended his call, turned to the room, and said flatly, "This meeting is paused, effective immediately." He gathered his notes, motioned to his counsel, and added, "We're not proceeding until GBD confirms reinstatement. If that doesn't happen by end of week, the deal is off." You could feel the temperature drop. Careers were evaporating in real time. Russell finally stood, adjusted his jacket, and looked at Blake for the first time since the firing. His tone was polite, almost gentle. "You said we were going in a new direction," he said. "Seems we have." Then he walked out, leaving behind a conference room full of executives who suddenly understood that the quiet man they dismissed as redundant had just frozen a $250 million acquisition with a single missing signature. That night, while the rest of the company spun into chaos, conference calls, damage control memos, frantic attempts to unpause the deal, Russell's phone rang. It wasn't from anyone at his company. The caller ID read, "Private line, Archer Holdings Board." He answered on the second ring, his tone even, unhurried. "Mr. Danner," a low, measured voice said, "I'm calling on behalf of our board. What do you want?" Russell didn't ask who was speaking. He didn't need to. The weight in that question told him it was someone who didn't waste time on small talk. He closed his notebook, glanced at the dark window, and spoke plainly. 3 things, he said. Reinstatement to my original role with full authority. A written apology for improper termination, signed by both CEOs. And an equity adjustment, 10 basis points, converted to voting shares post-close. The line went quiet. You could hear the board member breathing, probably calculating the cost of refusal. Then came a simple, done. Russell didn't thank him. He just said, send it in writing. I'll review and countersign. Then he ended the call. At 7:12 a.m., an internal memo leaked through the grapevine. Effective immediately, all communications regarding the acquisition transition will be reviewed by compliance and legal before release. Interim oversight reassigned pending clarification of role terminations. Translation. Blake was cut out. Every email, every call, every meeting, gone. He didn't even have access to the shared drive anymore. His Director of Transition title had become a ghost badge on a locked account. I saw him in the hallway that morning, pacing with his phone glued to his ear, whispering furiously to someone. I'm being set up, he hissed. They can't just freeze me out. But they could, and they had. HR's eyes wouldn't meet his when he demanded answers. It had already disabled his admin privileges. In the system, he was nobody. Russell, meanwhile, walked through the lobby with a calm that bordered on serene. He carried a single envelope, no briefcase, no entourage. Security greeted him like nothing had happened. He didn't need fanfare. Authority followed him naturally, like gravity. He passed Blake without acknowledging him, paused only to say to the receptionist, "Good morning," and continued to the elevator. By noon, both CEOs had signed the formal reinstatement letter. The apology was drafted, carefully worded, legal yet unmistakably contrite. The equity adjustment? Approved. It was cheaper to pay Russell for peace than risk a total collapse of the deal. When he walked into the executive suite later that day, conversations stopped. Blake's chair was empty, his nameplate gone. The meeting agenda had been rewritten, and in bold letters at the top of the attendee list was the name Russell H. Danner, Principal, GBD Licensing e Continuity Liaison. He took his seat, unbuttoned his jacket, and quietly reviewed the documents as if this had all been expected. Not a hint of triumph, not even satisfaction. Just composure. One of the younger analysts leaned over to me and whispered, "How can he stay so calm after all that?" I just shook my head. "Because he doesn't need to yell," I said. The paperwork already did it for him. By Thursday morning, the damage control had turned into outright surrender. The buyer's CEO sent a single email to the seller's board, short and surgical. The integration license will not be extended under Mr. Prescott's direction. We will resume negotiations only with reinstated Principal Danner. No threats, no drama, just a corporate guillotine dropping in one clean line. The seller's board erupted. Conference calls bled into each other. The CEO's voice cracked on every update. They'd gone from boasting about streamlining legacy operations to begging for a legacy employee's approval. And there wasn't a clause in existence that could save them. Legal tried to find a loophole, digging through Russell's old employment contract, the one Blake had mocked for being a relic from the fax era. Every section held. Every signature was airtight. It turned out Russell hadn't just signed his way into job security. He'd architected it. The HR director looked like she hadn't slept in days. She stood outside Russell's office with a manila folder clutched to her chest, whispering into her headset. The words, "liability exposure and wrongful termination reversal" floated through the air like ghosts. Within an hour, HR had issued a formal retraction of his termination, effective retroactively. They even sent him an apology letter on embossed paper, signed by both CEOs as if stationery could erase arrogance. When Russell arrived that morning, it was almost cinematic. He didn't storm in. He didn't make a scene. He walked through the glass doors at exactly 8 o'clock, the same as always, holding his coffee in one hand and a newspaper in the other. The lobby guards greeted him like they always had. The front desk smiled nervously. Every person he passed suddenly found a reason to look busy. Blake was nowhere in sight. Rumor said he'd been sent on leave, while the board conducted an internal review of his actions. a polite way of saying he'd been exiled from his own uncle's empire. His name had vanished from the internal directory overnight. Russell walked past the rows of cubicles, stopping briefly to glance at the glass-walled conference room where the chaos had begun. A few executives looked up from their laptops as he passed. He gave a small nod, nothing more, and continued on. When he reached his office, everything was exactly where he'd left it. The pen on his desk, the photo of his daughter at graduation, the faint smell of cedar polish. Even the "thank you for your service" mug someone had gifted him the day of the firing sat untouched, a relic of misplaced confidence. He set his coffee down, opened his laptop, and began reviewing integration notes like he'd only stepped out for lunch. From where I sat down the hall, I could see him through the glass, calm, composed, unbothered. The man everyone had written off as obsolete was now the reason the deal still had a pulse. When the CEO finally worked up the courage to visit, he hovered awkwardly in the doorway. "Russell," he began, voice low, "I just want to say, we regret how this was handled." Russell didn't look up. "Then handle it better," he said, still typing. Not cruel, not angry, just factual. He glanced toward the window, where the city skyline shimmered in the morning sun, and for the first time in weeks, there was no tension in his shoulders. The storm had passed. And somehow, he'd never even raised his voice to weather it. By the following week, the merger was back on track, but this time, everything looked different. The buyers had rewritten the agenda, reshuffled the hierarchy, and drawn a thick, deliberate line through Blake's name on every document. The updated term sheet arrived late Monday night, stamped and signed. One clause stood out like quiet poetry. Russell H. Danner, Continuity Partner, Governance Board. The title wasn't just ceremonial, it gave him direct voting rights over all post-integration operations. When the news broke internally, no one dared to question it. The same executives who'd once dismissed him as the guy who handles forms now waited outside his office before speaking. The tone of meetings shifted too. Where people used to talk over him, they now paused after every word, as if waiting for interpretation. Even the CEO, who'd once let his nephew bulldoze policy, deferred to Russell with cautious respect. At the next cross-company alignment call, the buyer's CEO opened with a pointed acknowledgement. "For this transition to work," he said, "we need continuity, and that continuity is Mr. Danner." The camera panned to Russell, seated at the end of the long glass table, hands folded, expression steady. He didn't smile or gloat. He simply nodded and said, "Let's proceed." Blake was not on the call. Rumors said he'd been reassigned to an external advisory role at one of the company's regional branches, a demotion masked as diplomacy. The official memo called it a learning opportunity. Unofficially, everyone knew it was exile with a polite signature. I watched Russell that day, and the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. He didn't look victorious. He looked resolved. There was a gravity to him now that filled the silence before he spoke. The kind that made people reconsider what they thought authority sounded like. During one of the planning sessions, the buyer's project lead asked him to walk through the revised operational model. Russell leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "We'll keep the original compliance spine intact. It was designed for longevity, not flash. Replace what's redundant, not what's reliable." The room went completely still, not because the advice was radical, but because everyone could feel the difference between arrogance and mastery. Blake's absence left a void that no one hurried to fill. The office that had once been his, a glass box plastered with motivational quotes and expensive furniture, was now dark. HR quietly reassigned it to legal. No one said the word nepotism out loud, but it hung in the air like static. As days passed, the integration began to move smoothly, faster than anyone expected. The buyers wanted Russell to stay on for a full year as the lead transition advisor. The formal invitation came from the board itself, not through HR. When the document landed on his desk, he signed it without a second thought. At the closing meeting that Friday, the buyer's CEO gestured toward him. "Mr. Danner, any final comments?" Russell adjusted his glasses. "Just one," he said. "Let's make sure our successors never confuse confidence for competence." The room fell quiet, No applause, no reaction, just that respectful stillness that comes when everyone in the room realizes who's truly in charge. 3 weeks later, the deal closed without a hitch. No legal delays, no compliance flags, no last-minute panic. Every document passed review under Russell's watchful eye. The integration that once seemed doomed now moved like clockwork. Quiet, deliberate, efficient. Even the buyers, notorious for micromanaging transitions, began describing the process as seamless. What none of them said out loud, though everyone knew, was that it only worked because Russell was steering the wheel. He didn't chase credit. He didn't give interviews or send victory emails. He just did what he'd always done, make systems work and people accountable. But this time, when executives passed him in the hallway, their nods carried something new: deference. They knew he had become more than an advisor. He was the anchor holding the whole operation together. When the closing dinner came, the venue was all polished marble and expensive wine, suits everywhere, all pretending to relax. The buyer's CEO stood to make the toast, glass raised, voice steady, to clean integration and clean exits. He said with a grin that wasn't entirely professional. A few chuckles followed. Everyone knew what he meant. Russell sat near the end of the long table, hands clasped, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The room was full of people who had once overlooked him and now orbited around his silence. Blake's chair, the one with his name on the original seating plan, sat empty. The event coordinator had removed the placard earlier that afternoon without comment. Somewhere, Blake was probably drafting a LinkedIn post about new beginnings. As the night went on, the conversation turned to next steps: governance strategy, board rotations, expansion plans. Each time Russell was asked for input, the chatter stopped. He spoke softly, precisely, like a man who knew the exact weight of his words. And when he finished, others didn't add. They agreed. After dessert, the buyer's CEO came over, offering a quiet handshake. "You saved this deal," he said simply. Russell only shrugged. "I just made sure it stayed honest." He stepped outside after midnight, the city humming below, lights stretching across the skyline. The air felt lighter now, not triumphant, just right. Everything had settled where it belonged. He took one last look at the reflection of the tower's logo in the glass doors. His company's name beside the buyer's finally merged. Beneath it, in fine print, the new governance clause carried his own title. He smiled to himself, turned toward the street, and murmured the truth only the paperwork could fully confirm. Titles are printed. Ownership is filed.